The Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 1. Still the same scene. It's still her and Solomon talking together over dinner. And then she speaks to Solomon, and she quits talking in her mind, and she tells Solomon something. I am the Rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. And what she says here is really a very important statement, because it shows her attitude about herself. Even though this rich, fabulous man, King Solomon, has asked her to marry him, her attitude is, I am the Rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. The Rose of Sharon and the lily of valleys were popular wedding flowers that the Jews used. She says, I'm like one of the most beautiful and popular flowers in our valley. I am a very special person. And then King Solomon comes back in verse 2 and says, like a lily among the thorns, so is my maiden, so is my darling among the maidens. Basically, what she's saying is she's talking about, I am the Rose of Sharon. She is talking about the most valuable possession a young woman brings to courtship and to marriage, and that is her self-image. What she thinks about herself. Having a high self-image is going to protect a young woman from more damage than about anything she can do. And a healthy self-image is something that is extremely important. But there are things that even though parents are trying to help their daughters and have good self-images, there are things out in society that many times are damaging to a healthy self-image. One of them is lack of praise. Everyone needs praise. Lack of praise from parents, maybe lack of praise from their classmates, whatever. They need this. One of the most damaging things, I believe, to a healthy self-image is peer pressure. There is tremendous peer pressure put upon young people in schools today that was not there whenever I was in high school 25 years ago. There is a lot more peer pressure today than there was then. And this peer pressure is put upon students basically in the form of the clothing that they wear and the kind of car their parents drive, where your house is, how wealthy your parents are. Students today do not think anything at all about going up to another student and asking them how much money their parents make, asking them where they live. If they do not have on the right clothing, then this is something that they make fun of them about. Nowadays, because of advertisements, there is tremendous pressure to wear the right labels. When I was in high school, wearing labels, letting your labels show, was a joke. The only person that let their labels show was Minnie Pearl, and she did that to make money, to look ridiculous and to be a joke. I remember when I was in high school and I was cramming 3 home ec courses into 2 semesters and was taking a sewing class, and I made my future husband a shirt. And so as I was showing this to my family, we were talking about giving this to them, my dad said, well, he says, I know a really good joke to play on Sam. He says, let's cut a label out of something and put a label in his shirt, and then this will just really be a good joke. And so we laughed about that. Yeah, that's a good joke to play on, because back then everybody wore homemade clothes, and we made our own clothes, or our mothers made their own clothes, and we were proud of them. Nobody thought anything about it. So if we wanted to play a joke on somebody, well, let's just put a label in his clothes and make it look store-bought instead of homemade. But times have changed because of the pressure that is put on children because through commercials to have the right labels. If you make the mistake of buying some clothing with the right label and registering, then all of a sudden in the mail you get all kinds of catalogs and advertisements to make your teenager or even younger child want all the right things. Here's if you're wearing the right things, and I know Esprit especially does this. They send you a catalog on a regular basis of here's the in thing. Here's what you need to get if you're going to be an in person. When we moved to California and my daughter started high school, it was a big thing to go shopping and to find exactly the right thing to wear for the first day of school. She came home from that first day of school and she was so relieved because some girl had come up to her and told her how ugly she was, and she said, thank goodness she didn't think my sweater was ugly. Now, my husband said, well, she's got that exactly backwards. She ought to be more concerned about what she thought about her. But it was okay for her to be ugly. Just don't think my sweater is ugly. So there is tremendous peer pressure put upon students through wearing proper clothing. In our class last week, we said every parent, hindsight is better than foresight. And if we had a chance to do it over, we would do things differently. And a word of hindsight to the parents that are here now, one thing that I would do different, and one thing that I am doing different with my student, when my daughter was going through these stages, and now that she's in college, the pressure is no longer there. I say, oh, don't you want something with a label? No. I'm more interested in style and fit and this sort of thing. As kids mature, they lose this desire for the right label, so we can be thankful for that. But during the junior high years, it is especially bad, and it is bad in high school. So if I had it to do all over again, back during this time when she was wanting all these labels, they're expensive, I resented the company's advertising and creating this desire. And why should I have to pay $50 or whatever it took for something where I can go buy a similar quality for a lot less and satisfy her need to have clothing without having the label? If I had it to do all over again, I would be more sympathetic with that child's need to wear the labels and be accepted at school than I was at that time, because of the peer pressure that is put upon students in this day and age. And so, as parents, I think we need to realize that they are living in a different time than what we lived in, and we need to be sympathetic with the things that are said to them that are unjust, things that are tearing down their self-image. So this is something that has nothing to do with how much praise the parents are giving them at home. You can do everything right at home and send your kid to school, and other students, because of the way that they talk to one another, is going to undo the damage, or is going to undo the good that you did. So I'll just pass that on for free. Another thing that damages their self-image is their own perfectionism, their own inability to realize that I'm growing up, I'm changing, I'm developing some of these qualities, and give themselves a chance to grow and mature. So a healthy self-image is a young girl's most valuable possession. She needs to have this healthy self-image, because it's going to help her in selecting a husband. It's going to make her be more particular. It's going to give her the ability, like the Shulammite did. She was able to tell King Solomon, I don't care if you are the king, I'm going to be particular, and I'm going to think about who it is that I marry. Now, a healthy self-image is not only very valuable for a young woman, it is also something that is needed in older women. Older women need to have a healthy self-image just as much as a young woman needs to have it. In Proverbs 31, this is back to the woman of great price. We can see that she had a healthy self-image. Okay, and in verses 17 and 18, here it is, it says, she girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She senses that her gain is good, and her lamp does not go out at night. So here it is, she does certain things, that she makes her arms strong. She senses that her gain is good. She feels good about what she does. Her lamp does not go out at night. A lot of times we read this about this woman of great price, and we think, man, what energy that woman had. She got up before dawn and figured out the food, gave assignments to her daughters, and here she is, has the lamp on at night, and she's working until the wee hours of the night. Well, that is not what this expression, her lamp does not go out at night, this is not what this is referring to. Back in their time, according to their customs, they did not have street lamps like we have today. And it was their custom to set a lamp in their windows at night and to leave it burning all night long, so that as people were walking down the street, the lamps from the houses would shine out into the street and they would give them light during the night. This woman is so organized that she is able to make sure that her lamp is full of oil before she goes to bed at night, and it is going to shine all night long so that people that have to be up at night can see their way. So she is an efficient woman who gets her jobs done, but she doesn't necessarily stay up all night long. In verse 25, it says, she makes linen garments and sells them. Verse 25, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she smiles at the future. So she has inner peace, and she smiles at the future. She has inner happiness. She has a good self-image. In verse 31, give her the product of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. She's well known in the community as a person who accomplishes what it is that God would have her to accomplish. And so she has a good, healthy self-image. Every woman needs a good self-image. A good self-image is the most protective quality that a woman does. It keeps her out of a lot of problems in selecting a mate and a lot of problems in marriage. But I want us to look at some things that take away a good, healthy self-image for an older woman. The first thing up here is self-criticism. Women, the little book I talked to you about last week about the differences between men and women, it talks about how they have tested to find that women really do have, I can't think of the word right now, but I'll come back to it in a minute. What women have is they have an ability to draw analogies that men don't have. Okay, women's intuition is what I was trying to think of. Okay, women have an ability to draw analogies that men do not have. An analogy is simply where you're taking one thing and comparing it with something else that is different. So women have this ability that men do not have. And this is very valuable in solving problems because a problem comes up and a woman begins to compare it and draw conclusions about it and she's able to come to a solution to it. Men do not have this to the same degree. Now, a lot of times what women do with this analogy is they go beyond the point of solving their problems in a good, just way, and they begin to blame themselves. If only I could get pregnant. If only I hadn't gotten pregnant so many times. If only if I was prettier. If only my husband would love me, things would be great. And women blame themselves unjustly for things that are not their fault. And this is something that causes them to have a bad self-image. In Ephesians 5, verse 28, this is where God tells husbands to love their wives as their own bodies. Men, generally speaking, do not have a problem loving themselves. Women do. So God recognizes that men do not have this problem. You love yourself, but you love your wife the same way. In 2 Timothy 3, verses 6 through 7, let's turn over there and look at that passage. In 2 Timothy 3, verses 6 through 7, okay, here it is. It says, "For who among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women, weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth?" So here it is, he's talking about that certain women are led on by various impulses, always learning, but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. You know, women buy the majority of the books in this country. They buy the majority of the self-help books. It's not the men. It's the women who are always looking for answers, who are trying to find a solution for their problems. So when women do this away from God's Word, then they are going to have problems when they're doing it outside God's Word. So, self-criticism, and this is something when we take the series on desperate marriages, we're going to talk about this a lot, and we're going to work a lot on not doing this, on how to overcome this, because it is very damaging to a woman's self-image. Verbal and physical abuse is something that's very damaging to a woman's self-image, and the little chart I handed you earlier has a column in there for emotional abuse. And you can see from reading that exactly how verbal and physical abuse is damaging to a woman's self-image. Misunderstanding the role, just misunderstanding what being a woman is all about, can cause a low self-image. Lack of control of one's life can also cause a low self-image. And let's turn over to Proverbs 14, verse 10. Okay, here it says, "The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy." While we as parents would like to give our daughters good, healthy self-images, we can't do that. We can do certain things to make it easy for them to have a good, healthy self-image. But in the end, it rests with them whether or not they have a good, healthy self-image. It rests with us whether or not we have a good, healthy self-image. Because it says the heart knows its own bitterness, or the mind knows its own bitterness. It's responsible for its thoughts. And a stranger can't come along and he can't share or really give you joy. You are responsible for your own. So we need to recognize that we're the ones that needs to be in control of having a healthy self-image. In Proverbs 18, verse 14, here it says, "The spirit of a man can endure his sickness, but a broken spirit who can bear?" If somebody has a poor self-image and a broken spirit, a depressed attitude, we can't make that person happy in spite of themselves. That person has to be willing to be happy. And the harder we try to make somebody happy that does not want to be happy, or who's not willing to make themselves happy, the more frustrated we're going to become, the more that person is going to lean upon us and the more we are going to fail in that role. It is just absolutely an impossible thing to make someone happy. They have to decide to be happy within themselves. In Proverbs 25, verse 28, Proverbs 25, verse 28, here it says, like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. So if we're not willing to control our attitude towards ourselves, or whatever it is that where our spirit needs to be controlled, then we're just like a city that has no walls. We're without control of our life. And then in Colossians 3:19, the last point up here is failure to expect others to exercise self-control. And in Colossians 3:19 is one that applies specifically to the marriage relationship, talking about the command to the husband in Colossians 3, verse 19. And here it is, it says, husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. So it is the husband's responsibility to not be bitter. It is not the wife's responsibility to make him happy or to make him not be bitter. It is his responsibility. God gives it to him. And we're going to be talking in our class on desperate marriages how to turn that responsibility back over to the man, because it is very important. And so having a healthy self-image is very important for an older woman just as it is for a young woman. It gets them out of a lot of relationship problems, whether it's a boyfriend or a husband. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more after we have our break. But before we take our break, I want us to notice back in the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, she has demonstrated this good, healthy self-image. I am the lily of the Rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. And then Solomon, I kind of Song of Solomon here. He says, so is my darling a lily among thorns. He says, all the other maidens are just like thorns compared to you. Here it is, she has dared to tell King Solomon, who has proposed to her, I am special. I may be black, but I'm lovely. I am special. I don't have to marry you. I can marry whoever I want. She's got this self-confidence. And what does Solomon tell her? That's right. All these other maidens that are running around waiting on you and waiting on me, they are thorns compared to you. Then in her mind, she's going to go back to the shepherd and she's going to compare Solomon to the shepherd. And so as she goes back to the memories of the shepherd in Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, she says, like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. In his shade I took great delight and sat down, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. So here it is, she says, when you compare my beloved to all the other young men, my beloved is like an apple tree. And when you think about the kinds of trees that grow in a forest, you don't normally think about apple trees growing in the forest. You think of the big evergreen trees fighting for light and trying to crowd the other trees out so that they can get the sun, survival of the fittest of the trees in the forest. And so she says, my beloved is not like these young men. He is like an apple tree. And when you think about an apple tree is something that is good to have in your yard. An apple tree gives you good shade and also gives you food to eat and to sustain yourself. She's saying, my beloved is good for me. He is very beneficial for me. And we're going to come back and talk about this expression a little bit more, but I want us to go ahead and get this her whole speech here. And she says, he has brought me to his banquet hall, and his banner over me is love. So here it is, she's making another play on where she is. She is in Solomon's banquet hall, eating out of his gold silverware and his gold plates and his gold cups. She's here with him, and she compares that to the shepherd's banquet hall, which is going to be much more humble. She says, he has brought me to his banquet hall, and his banner over me is love. Now, it is the custom of royalty in Europe, you can still see this today, and it was the custom of royalty at this time to have banners. Anytime King Solomon went somewhere, he had banner bearers carrying his banners along in front of him in his traveling couch that would have like his family crest or whatever, his symbols, flags, things that symbolized the king and his royalties. This is something that just let people know that he was there, and here is a person of high stature. So no doubt while she was in Solomon's banquet hall, he had certain very impressive, ornate banners there for her to see. And so in comparing this to what the shepherd has, his banner, he doesn't have any of these fancy banners like Solomon has. He doesn't have any banners of royalty, but his banner over me is love. He surrounds me with with love. And this is the thing that she is noticing. The main thing that is different is that the shepherd loves her. What he has to offer is humble in comparison, but he gives her this love in comparison to King Solomon's royalty. Now, the last time I taught the Song of Solomon, I had, prior to that occasion, I had taken the training program at the women's shelter in Santa Maria. And as I went through the Song of Solomon, I began to notice things that I had not noticed before. And one thing that I noticed was this expression that he is like an apple tree. How really significant that is. Because those of us who have good husbands a lot of times we kind of tend to take some of these things for granted and do not really realize that you cannot say this about every young man. You cannot say that every young man is like an apple tree. You cannot say that every husband is like an apple tree, that he is good for me. His banner over me is love. And so this is something a young girl should ask herself. Is this boyfriend that I'm getting serious about, is he like an apple tree? Is he someone who is good for me, who is protective of me, who provides for me, or is he someone who is harmful for me? And as we begin to think about whether or not he is harmful for me or not, something that young girls need to realize is about the cycle of violence that exists today. Because this cycle, one thing I learned in the women's shelter is that this cycle always begins early. It is very rare for it to begin late in a marriage. And many times it begins in courtship. And so young girls need to be aware of this and aware of exactly what is involved in it so that they can watch out for it and protect themselves from it. In the cycle of violence, what it is you see that it's a circle, but it usually starts up where tension is building up because of some problem coming up. So here's some problem and tension is starting to build up. And then you have what is an acute episode. And in this acute episode, there's all sorts of things that may happen that we'll talk about later. He may simply he may slap her, or he may push her. He may shove her. He may do something like that, or he may actually beat her up. So there's all sorts of things that can happen here in this acute episode. And then right after the acute episode, then you have what is loving response. Oh, he is so sorry. Oh, he will never do it again. He is so ashamed. He may cry. He may get down on his knees and plead. But unless something is done to stop this, and usually it is the woman who has to do what has to be done to stop it, unless something is done to stop it, then it starts all over again. It builds, tension builds up again, and then you have your acute episode, and then he is so sorry. I promise I'll never ever do it again. And it goes on and on and on. And what happens is, it starts out in courtship a lot of times with the early years of the marriage. One woman, this started on her honeymoon. Her husband slapped her on her honeymoon. She slapped him back, and I'm not recommending that, but she slapped him back, so he never slapped her again. But he verbally abused her every day of their life. And when she came and talked to me, they had been married about 20 years, and she was considering suicide at that point. Before it had got to that point, she had left him, had become a prostitute on Skid Row, downtown Seattle, and then had been restored and come back to him, and then this went on, and then here 20 years later, she's considering suicide. So this had gone on for 20 years, round and around this cycle. Some women, when they see this building up and they see this acute episode, they know it's going to happen, so they deliberately pick a fight with their husband just to go ahead and get it over with, and so we can start this cycle again. But what happens is we have this cycle of violence, is that this cycle of loving respite, a lot of women are fooled because he is so loving, he is so attentive, he is so tender, and it is appealing to a woman's emotional nature, and so she's really impressed by that. What she does not realize, that as this goes on and on and on, this side of the circle gets longer and longer, and the loving respite part gets shorter and shorter and may eventually disappear over a period of time. So we need to realize that there is a cycle of violence, and once it starts, the person who has the most power to stop it is the woman. We're going to talk a little bit about how it is she stops that. But as young girls who are dating, if you start to begin to see these characteristics in a young man, you need to realize that this is something that is going to get worse. And as I learned this at the women's shelter, these were people who were not Christians. They were not interested in going by Bible principles. They were simply saying, this is the way it is out in the world. And so this is something that we need to realize, that a man, what they said, a man who is slapping or shoving in his 20s is breaking bones, knocking out teeth, sending women to the hospitals in his 40s. So we need to impress upon our young women that this is something that is going to get worse. For her to think, I can just love him and I'll help him, I'll love him out of this, is very unrealistic. It's not dealing with reality. And we're going to have to stop it simply by the woman having a good, healthy self-image like the Shulammite had and saying, I will not put up with this. You go find yourself another girlfriend. I think more of myself than this. I'm the Rose of Sharon. I'm the lily of the valley. I deserve to be treated better than this. So we need to realize about this cute episode of violence, because it is something that is real. It really exists. And it is something, the best time to put a stop to it is in courtship. Because if a girl does not put a stop to it then she's going to have problems later on. A lot of times what these women do, they're able to endure it, to emotionally endure it for about 20 to 25 years. And then they are finally so emotionally fed up that what they do is they get a divorce. And you read about these cases in the newspapers all the time when you read about these murders where some man goes out and kills his family. He's usually a man in his 40s, mid-40s somewhere, and his wife has left him. She's gotten fed up and she's left, and then he has become so accustomed to violence that he has gone out and done this thing to his family. I have a couple of articles here from Ann Landers where people have written into her. Ann Landers and Dear Abby's columns are filled with these stories all the time. Here's one girl says, I am 16 years old and have been reading your column ever since I was in the 5th grade. I feel as if you're my own personal counselor. I have been going with Stuart for nearly 6 months. We have a wonderful time together and everything is terrific. But when he loses his temper, which is often, he hits me. He has sprained my wrist and given me some huge black and blue marks. Once he slapped my face so hard it left red marks for 2 days. I really do love Stuart, and when we get along, it is heaven. This is my first serious boyfriend, and I want it to be my last. I mean, I would like to spend the rest of my life with him. Please, Anne, don't tell me to leave this guy. Just tell me how to change him. Thanks for your help. Well, you can imagine what Dear Abby tells her. She says, get some counseling at once and find out why you want to stay in a relationship with a fellow who slaps your face and sprains your wrists. There is no way that you can change that guy. He will have to change himself, and unfortunately, he will probably become more cruel and abusive as time goes on. Please save this column and look at it every day and until the advice soaks in. It could be the most important column you've read in your entire life. In a later class, we're going to talk about sweetheart murders, or what that is where your sweetheart murders you. It's about sweetheart murders and date rapes. And we're going to find that the men, or the boys, who are most likely to commit these crimes are men who are involved in some type of abuse, such as what we're talking about now, who are slapping and hitting and punching, or maybe doing verbal abuse. Okay, here's another one. She says, I have been married for 8 months. These have been the worst 8 months of my life. Strangely enough, to look at us, you would bet that we are the happiest couple in town. Ed and I are attractive, outgoing professionals with excellent incomes. We have a lovely home and 2 new cars. In public, Ed treats me like a queen. At home, he is both physically and mentally abusive. I have no one to blame but myself, however. The abuse started well before we married. If I went into detail about the beatings, you'd think I was making it up. If you met Ed, you would not believe my story. He is totally charming. I can count the number of women who have told me how lucky I am. The reason I'm writing you is to warn other women. Men who are abusive will not change after marriage, no matter what they say. It only gets worse. I don't know what is going to happen, Anne, but I hope I live to start my life over again. So these are some stories that are real, and that we need to realize that we shouldn't be so desperate for a boyfriend or so desperate to get married that we are willing to put up with someone who mistreats us, because we need to have this healthy self-image of ourselves that we don't deserve to be treated this way, and that we're not willing to put up with this. My husband, one time, we had, when we lived in Spokane, we used to have preachers come through all the time to help my husband do the radio program. And one time we had a preacher come through, and he was telling us about his teenage daughter. And he told us about that they had had some family problems and that she was living with another family at that present time. And he said that this daughter, and my husband had met her on another occasion, and he said she was a very attractive young lady, very pleasant personality, pleasant to be around, no glaring faults, anything of this nature. And he said, as the father was talking about how that as she was living with this other couple and began to confide in the woman, that she had this boyfriend that everybody felt was way beneath her, that she was capable of attracting a much more worthy man, like the shepherd was a worthy man. He was one all the maidens loved. He was a successful man. But she confided in this woman, and the reason why she was placing all of her hopes in this boy that was way beneath her was because she was convinced that she could never ever get another boyfriend, that it was either him or none. Well, any woman who has lived with an abusive husband, and I have no personal experience to know what that is like, but during the last several years I have been reading as many books on this subject and as many personal stories on this subject as I can to make myself be more aware of this. All of the women who have gone through this type of abusive cycle and have seen it get worse over the years, they think it would be better to never get married than to marry a man like this and to have the damage that is done to your self-image and to put up with this type of treatment. Because while a woman may think she can just love a man out of it, it never works, and it is something that's very damaging to them. Now, this paper that I passed out to you, I want us to look at it a little bit and talk about it. This is something that came from my manual that I went through at the women's shelter. And this is something that really got my attention. You notice over here in this column, it's potentially dangerous, highly dangerous, and then lethal, where he's committing homicide or suicide and death. Potentially dangerous things: pinching, squeezing, push, shove, restrain, jerk, pull, shake, slap, bite, hair pull. These are things that many men tend to minimize. All I did was put a police restraint on her, or all I did was pull her hair, something like this. Well, these are things that are really very serious things. These are things that are starting this cycle. I don't know about the laws in Washington, but the laws in California are, if a policeman sees a man shove his wife, push her, jerk her, pull her, he will arrest him, he will go to jail, he will go before a judge. The judge will tell him that he will either have to get counseling or he will have to stay in jail. And that is if the policeman sees him do these things. These things are considered crimes against the woman. These are serious things. Then here is all the emotional abuse that goes with it. And so you can see how this damages a woman's self-image. Ignoring her feelings, withholding approval as punishment, repeated humiliation, public and private, blaming the victim for all faults, labeling crazy, bitch, whore. Acts of psychological abuse may be compared to acts of brainwashing during wartime, depriving the person of food or sleep. Example of victims usually report psychological abuse is worse than the physical abuse. Psychological abuse is effective because the victim of the abuse is also threatened with acts of violence, physical violence or death, not only to herself but to her families as well. He may threaten to kill her family or her children or her parents. So there's all kinds of emotional abuse that goes along with this. The shelter where I went to in Santa Maria for the training, they kept their address private, secret. In fact, there was a law passed that if you told anybody the address of the women's shelter, I don't remember if you went to jail or you just got a heavy fine. They were serious about keeping their location secret because they did not want any of these abusive men coming and endangering the lives of women that were in their shelter. So if you were an abused woman, you called them up and you said, I need to come into your shelter for protection. What they would do is they would set up a neutral place to meet you and they would interview you. They wanted to determine if you were on alcohol, if you were on drugs, and certain things like that. They would not allow you to come into their shelter. And so they would set up a neutral place. And they said they would often ask these women, tell me a little bit what you look like. So maybe at a restaurant, we'll go meet at a restaurant. And so they would ask the woman, tell us what you look like so that we'll recognize you and we'll know what you are. And they said that the number of times that these women would describe themselves as being fat, this was a very common description these women would give. Yet when they would go to the restaurant to meet them, they were very thin and trim women. And the reason they had described themselves as being fat, is because their husband had told them that so many times. They no longer saw themselves in a realistic way, and they believed that about themselves. So this emotional abuse is a very serious thing. Then somebody jokes about the role of women, and he denies the victim her history of heritage and religion. And this is something that we're going to talk about in our class on desperate marriages, that psychologists are now starting to recognize a third area of abuse. There is mental abuse and physical abuse, and now they are recognizing spiritual abuse, which is denying her religion, her right to worship God, her right to think and to draw conclusions spiritually for herself, and that is something they're calling spiritual abuse. And then the abuse continues by making her look at or making jokes about women as sex objects. Jealousy may become extreme, minimizing her feelings and needs regarding sex, sexual criticism. Now this is just at the very beginning. This is just the potentially dangerous. This is just where it starts. And you can see that's not very pleasant. That's not very good. But then as you go on down here to dangerous, he's shaking with bruises, hits, touch, kick, choking, objects thrown, targeted or repeated hitting for punishment. Threatens violence. He puts down her ability as a worker. He tells her about his affairs, demands her attention. He resents the kids, threatens her with abusing or getting custody of the children for all of this mental abuse. And I'm not going to go ahead and read all of this, but I just want you to mainly see the different categories. These are their categories for putting a man in a category. And this is something, when I went over this the first time when I was exposed to this really made an impression upon me. My husband and I were involved with counseling a couple where there was some abuse, and he would just say, "Oh, I just restrained her," or "I just did this." He was continually minimizing what he did, and so we need to be careful that we don't, "Oh, he just slapped me." Whatever it is, these aren't little things, and we need to realize these are considered abuse. You get down here to the highly dangerous. Household objects as weapons, restraining and hitting, broken bones, eternal injury, medical treatment needed, use of knives, guns, poisons for disabling or disfiguring. Now these guys that are doing this, they started out way up here at the top and they progressed down the line. And that is the main message that the counselors at the shelter try to get to the women that come in. It is going to get worse until you put a stop to it, until you refuse to allow yourself to be treated this way. You have got to put a stop to it. Okay, then the highly, we did the highly dangerous, and then under highly dangerous, kind of interesting here, you've got destruction of property, hits, punches, or kicks walls, chairs, not her. So this is something, instead of hitting her, then he's just destroying all the furniture around her, destroying the walls, and this is just as bad. This is in the highly dangerous category, but a lot of times people tend to take these type of acts as not being so bad, but we need to realize that these are bad. A man threatening suicide is considered a type of abuse. I know one woman who was having a lot of problems in her marriage, trying to call up some feelings about why did you marry him. What came out was he threatened, "If you don't marry me, I'm going to commit suicide." So she married him. And he wasn't abusive to her physically, but this is considered. In fact, this was a case of husband abuse. She was physically abusive to him, but she married him because he threatened suicide. That is a type of abuse, and is something that we need to recognize that is that, and not marry someone just because he's threatening suicide. That is not what a good marriage is built upon. Basically, all of these things that are dealing with abuse are reaction to problems. Normal problems of life. Instead of dealing with these in an adult manner, then they are dealing with them in a physical way. And it's kind of like what Hagar is talking about here. Hagar and his wife. Hagar says, "I'm tired of this constant arguing. Let's settle this like adults." Well, that should be all of us' goal, to learn how to settle problems like adults. Unfortunately, Hagar has a little bit left to learn on that. His wife says, "A chug-a-lug contest is not settling it like adults." So there's more to just saying let's settling it like adults than settling it like adults. Really, what it all boils down to is simply growing up. When we get married, it is time to grow up. It is time to learn how to solve problems in an adult way. As we are growing up, about the first 20 years of our life, we are spending that growing up physically. The next 20 years of our life, and usually it's our married time, we're learning how to grow up emotionally. We are getting rid of a lot of childish habits, a lot of childish ways of doing things. And a man who solves his problems by giving in to anger is solving his problems in a childish way. And if his wife allows him to do that, then she is taking away an opportunity for him to grow up. She is making it easy for him to continue to act like a child. And these men that are engaging in this type of abuse, they may be 40 years old or 45 or 50 or 60 years old. They are still very childish in their way of thinking and their way of dealing with problems. So we want to marry someone like the Shulammite said. He is like an apple tree. He is good for me. He is growing up. He's someone who is learning to control his anger and to deal with his anger. So when a young lady is confronted with a boy who is abusive to her, there's two things that she can do. One thing she can do for herself and one thing she can do for that boy. The one thing she can do for herself is to tell him that she is the Rose of Sharon, the lily of the valley, and she does not deserve to be treated that way, and she will not be treated that way. Now she needs to say that to herself, have that attitude for herself. And then she needs to do that for herself to protect herself. And the thing she needs to do for that young man to protect him, if she really loves him and cares about him, is she needs to tell him that. I'm not going to be your girlfriend because you hit me or you yanked me or whatever it was he did. I am not going to be your girlfriend until you learn to grow up and to act in a more adult way. He needs to experience the consequences of his actions. When we cover up, when we say, oh, it's my fault, I shouldn't have sassed him, or I shouldn't have been late, or I shouldn't have done this, or I shouldn't have done that, it doesn't matter what we did. He does not have the right to do that. These men are very protective of their authority. I'm the man. I'm the leader. I'll yell if I want to because I'm the head of this family. This is their attitude. I'm the leader. I can do whatever I want because I'm the leader. And we need to take that and turn it around on them. Yes, you are going to be the head of the family. Yes, you are the leader. And it is because of that you do not have the right to do that. It doesn't matter what any of us do. A man does not have the right to do these things. And so we need to love ourselves enough that we let them know that we will not put up with it. And we need to love them enough to tell them this so that they can experience the consequences of their actions and they can be motivated to grow up. Today a girl feels lovesick. Well, what do you want? A box of chocolates, the same thing here. Well, she didn't have chocolates back then. What she had was raisin cakes. So go get me something sweet to eat because I'm lovesick. I'm longing for the shepherd. Here I am in Solomon's tent. I'm surrounded by all of this, but I'm emotionally involved with the shepherd. He's the one I want. I'm lovesick for him. Then she says, let his left hand be under my head and his right hand embrace me. So here she's looking forward to the sexual relationship with him. She's got a healthy attitude towards this relationship. It's a relationship for marriage. She's saving it for marriage and she's looking forward to it. Then we come to the theme of the Song of Solomon. In verse 7, where she tells these maidens, and this is the end of our scene here, she says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you will not arouse or awaken my love until it pleases. So here it is. She tells them to adjure you. This means to 7 times, to pledge yourself, O daughters of Jerusalem. Look out and see what's natural in nature, and do not force Solomon upon me until I really love him, till I'm really ready. Now, as long as I've been teaching the Song of Solomon, we're going to see that the Shulammite makes this statement 3 times. Do not force Solomon upon me. Don't, I adjure you, by the gazelles and the hinds of the field, by what's natural, don't arouse my love until it's ready. She says this 3 times. This is the theme. And I wondered, where in the world did she get this? Where did this young girl learn that? And I'm convinced that God must have given me a teenage daughter so I could get the answer to that question. Because this is what all parents tell their teenagers. They say, cool it, relax, He's not the only guy out there. There's plenty others out there. You've got time. You don't have to, this one boyfriend doesn't have to be it. And so this is what her mother apparently has been telling her throughout the years as they've lived out there in the country. They've seen the animals mating and courting. She tells her, by the hinds and the gazelles of the field, do not arouse or awaken my love until it's ready. You've got plenty of time for love. Take your time. And so this is what she tells the maidens. Do not force Solomon upon me until I really love him like I love the shepherd. Okay, we're going to stop right there for tonight. And we still have a little bit of time for questions and comments. Does anybody have a question or a comment? Shirley came up between class and made a comment to me. You want to share it with us, Shirley?
Well, it was about peer pressure that when I was in high school at Highlight in Marion, I hate to say it, but it was about 1950. That if you didn't have cashmere sweaters and George shoes, that you were just, they tended to look down on you. And they would even go so far as to come up behind you and, look at the labels.
Okay.
But I really don't know what my mother did, but she instilled in us that that's okay. You are different. You are special. You don't have to be like everybody else. And I was always proud that I didn't have it. And so I was glad that I think partly her motive behind it all was that we couldn't afford them. But she did a good job because we didn't even miss them.
Okay, good. Does anybody else have a comment or a question about peer pressure? Some of you teenagers that are right in the middle of it. Okay, I almost forgot to give you your homework. That'd be bad, wouldn't it? Okay, you're going to have to copy this down. In Volume 1, and if you have the old blue book, this is reading the Song of Solomon, so you just read up to the point where we covered tonight. So read pages 294 through page 309. Do the study exercise on page 313. And then do the research exercise on page 314. And this research exercise, all that is involved is each week I'd like for you to read the Song of Solomon from chapter 1, verse 1 through the end, realizing that if you've not been through the Song of Solomon before, it's not going to all make sense to you. But if you will do that every week, by the time we finish the Song of Solomon, you will be so familiar with the language of it that it will belong to you. You'll feel very comfortable with the Song of Solomon, and by the time we finish, it will make sense to you. So if you'll read it, that's going to be about 6 times over a period of the next 6 weeks, then you're going to have a lot to show for that. And you're going to know a lot of the verses without ever having sat down and memorized any of it. Then read chapters 5 and 6, this is still in Volume 1, to raise your self-image as a woman. So those are chapters about the creation and the fall that I think you will enjoy. And basically what I want the teenagers to focus on is reading the first part of this assignment is right up here and doing this homework. And if you have time for this, okay. But basically I'd like you to focus on this part of the assignment up here. One lady told me that I know she's been working on her homework all week long, but she still had some writing to do this afternoon, and her husband had something he wanted her to do. So she told him that she needed to work on her assignment, and even got out the little guarantee that I gave you last week and showed it to him and said this is what she wants to do. And he started to get on to her a little bit and says, well, but 3 days ago, and she's learning how, in the course of arguments, not to let him change the issue. The issue's not 3 days ago. The issue is today. So she ignored that part of it and told him that he ought to be supporting her because he would be benefiting from this, and made him stay with today, and that I really need to do this homework. So he went off and let her do her homework then and didn't make her do what he wanted her to do. So I'm proud of her for doing that and glad that she had that kind of devotion to doing her homework. Well, we have a little bit of time. Does anybody else have a question or comment? It's a lot easier to change that when they're young than when it is when they're older. And a lot of times if a wife starts early enough, she can motivate him enough that he can change that because he's growing and developing. And it depends on his family. So we're going to see a little bit later that the Shulammite looked at the shepherd's family. What kind of family did he come from? If he came from an abusive family, at the shelter they would let the women bring their children, but they would not allow them to bring males 12 years and older because they were already picking up the abusive part, and they did not want these young boys abusing the women in the shelter. So if he's come from an abusive family, see, then that is something completely different, and yes, he needs to have some professional help. And we're going to talk about, when we get into the desperate marriages, we're going to talk about, there's certain times that my husband and I, we just tell people, this is out of our ability to help you, and you need to get professional help in this. And what we tell them is, if you do not get professional help, we are not going to work with you anymore, because we cannot help you in this because of your anger and because of your family background of it. So and of course what happens with these fellows when they go through this loving cycle after they're repenting of what they're doing, this is just so wonderful and so great. It's real easy for a girl to be swept off her feet and think, man, this guy is just really something. But you need to have a period of time, don't tell him this, you've got to straighten up or we're not getting married, and then get married next month. So you need to have a period of time of him proving himself. Okay, does anybody else have a question or comment? Okay, we're going to stop right there. And Judy, would you lead us in a word of prayer?